Hi everyone, Stepan here. Today I'm going to continue the D4 series with the Blackmar Gambit or the Blackmar Diemer Gambit, which is an absolutely insane opening which should be played with great care. And the first thing I'm going to say is it's not a gambit in which your main asset is if my opponent doesn't know theory, I win. It's not like that. It's a gambit in which even if black doesn't know the theory, he can survive, and it's a gambit that black can easily decline and lead you into a ton of theory. That being said, if you are well prepared, you're going to get very fun attacking positions in which black is inevitably going to be the one defending, and in which you are going to have a lot of attacking options and a lot of attacking patterns at your disposal, many of which are repetitive and easy to learn, and you are going to be able to employ them from game to game without having to think too much. Now, the second advantage is that black is not going to expect this. So let's get into the opening. After d4, d5, there are many normal moves, c4 being the soundest, but we play e4, the Blackmar Gambit or the Blackmar Diemer Gambit. I've been playing d5 for 4 years. I've never faced this in a tournament game. I've faced it online and I've beaten it because I was prepared, and I'm going to show you what I play. But since this is a white gambit, I'm going to show you all the options for white and all the options for black so that you can choose for both sides. So the first thing that should be mentioned is taking the pawn is absolutely correct, and the engine prefers black after taking the pawn, and with correct play afterwards, black should have an advantage according to the engine regardless of what white does. But there are two ways to decline the gambit. Black can play either c6 going into the Caro-Kann, this is now the Caro-Kann, or black can play e6 going into the French. So the first thing you should note, if you plan to play the Blackmar Diemer Gambit, you have to know the Caro-Kann and the French. You basically have to be a quite good e4 player before going into this, because if black, for example, plays d5 against d4, and against e4 he plays the Caro-Kann, he will of course play c6 going into the Caro-Kann so that he doesn't have to deal with all of this stuff. So my advice for tournament players is, when you prepare for a game, if your opponent plays d5 against d4 and against e4 he plays the Sicilian or e5 or the Alekhine or whatever else, Pirc modern, then play this, because they will not be as comfortable going into the French or the Caro-Kann. Now, into the opening, taking the pawn. So, when this opening was originally discovered and played by Blackmar, he wrote an article at the end of the 19th century for a chess magazine, and he played the move f3. That's the original Blackmar Gambit, just playing f3. Since then, since the end of the 19th century, the move knight c3 has been introduced. So this move basically creates a threat, threatens to take a pawn, and white has a slightly better position if he manages to take the pawn. So after the move knight c3, black is given two options, and we are going to go through both. I'll first try to explain what the gambit is about. So to explain that, I'll just show you the main move, knight f6, after which white always plays pawn to f3. Now what's the idea? Well, after this pawn is taken and knight f3 is played, you can see that white has given up a pawn. That's clear. White doesn't have an e pawn and white doesn't have an f pawn. What do you get in exchange for that? Well, your knight has a great square on e5, which means that f7 is weak. So that's one attacking idea. Your bishop has the c4 square, which means that f7 is weak. You can castle short, which means that f7 is weak. Your queen can come out to h5, your queen can come out to h4 via e1, which means that black's kingside is weak. So the main idea of the Blackmar Gambit is to create as much pressure as soon as possible and make it very hard for black to defend. So that's the main idea of the gambit. You give up a pawn, but you develop all of your pieces to perfect squares, and it will take black time to develop himself. Okay, there are two options after knight c3. And we are going to go through both of them. Knight f6, as I said, is the main line. And after knight f6, f3, e takes f3, knight takes f3, there are a couple of options. Black can play bishop to g4, which is the main line, but he can also play bishop f5, which is extremely interesting, and this is what I play with black. And I believe this is just the soundest way to try and punish the gambit. I'm going to get into that. He can also play e6 and g6. All of these have a name. And believe it or not, the Blackmar is a very well theoretically developed opening. So we are going to go through 4 different defenses for black in the main line. One thing I would like to mention is that taking with the queen on move 5, the so-called rider gambit, is simply bad because of queen takes d4, and even if you do get in bishop e3, that's simply bad. One pattern that you should know is that once this bishop has developed, and then you take on f3, then there's a weakness on b7, which is going to be a familiar pattern after the video. So taking with the queen on f3, after, for example, bishop g4, bishop takes, and queen takes, makes it very hard for black to play, because he has to play c6, otherwise b7 is hanging. But taking with the queen on move 5 is simply not good. Okay, 2 more options if black doesn't take on f3, which we are going to look at briefly, are bishop f5 on move 4 and e3 on move 4. Those are not a problem at all for white, and I remember when I was preparing for this 4 years ago, I actually discarded them straight away. Now, one very serious option which we are going to be looking at is, instead of playing knight f6, the only other sensible option for black is the so-called Lemberger counter gambit with pawn to e5, and this is very interesting. This is actually what I would like to start with, because I believe that most Blackmar players are going to have a hard time dealing with this, because black is, well, fighting fire with fire, and it's not easy to respond to this. Alright, so let's start with e5. After e5, by far the most popular move is queen h5, and I believe this move plays for an element of surprise. That being said, the move is simply not good, and there's a much better option which I would like to show you. In this position, most players with black respond with knight f6, and this is of course great for white, because you take on e5, and after bishop e6 you now play knight takes e4, and this is great. It's not much better for white, but your bishops are open, your knight can come out to f3, there's no bishop d6, you're threatening to take on f6, and this is great. However, after queen h5, black has the option of taking on d4. So for those of you who play d5 and you are facing the Blackmar, playing e5 is still a good option if you don't think white is perfectly prepared. If white plays queen h5, which has been played by grandmasters, then you can simply continue queen takes d4. And now white's best is knight g2, and after knight f6 attacking the queen, the e5 pawn is of course protected. I mean, I don't know what to suggest here. The best way to play is knight takes queen, knight takes queen, knight d to b5, knight a6, and this is simply not good. If you do play knight d5, then king d7, and this is simply better for black. Okay, so against queen h5, black should continue queen takes d4. I'm sorry, my phone is ringing. Somebody, let me just answer this. Halo. Dobar dan. Yeah. Hvala, Jenja. I'm sorry about this. I was expecting a call because my I don't know English anymore, because my dishwasher is broken, and the dishes come out cold and there's no steam coming out, which means that there's no heat inside, so I will have a repair guy coming in later this afternoon. So since it was a number I didn't know, then it was him, and it was him, so I had to answer. I'm sorry about it. This is probably the first time I've talked on the phone during a video. I hope you'll excuse me. Okay, so queen h5. Against queen h5, you simply play queen takes d4. And as we saw, knight g2, knight f6, exchange of queens, great for black. So instead of queen h5, there are two more options. One option which I would like to mention is the endgame variation, in which you take on e5, and after queen d1, king d1, knight c6, knight takes e4, knight takes e5. This is slightly better for black. There's no doubt about that. The position is absolutely symmetrical, with one difference, that black is able to castle. So firstly, this is not in the nature of the Blackmar Gambit. Secondly, it's very hard to create anything, and black should be slightly better. So here's what I would recommend against e5. That's the move knight g to e2. And this move may seem strange at first, but there's a very clear idea. You are simply threatening to regain your material with knight takes e4, and regardless of what black does, you're not going to have a worse position. So let's look at f5 first, because you can expect that to be played in a majority of the games. Against f5, you can play d5, and now after queen e1, queen d1, king d1, knight e7, preparing to win the pawn with knight c6 and knight g6, you can simply continue f4, and after ef3 you play gf3, and you have saved your pawn. So f5 is not a problem. This is actually a great position. If, for example, knight c6, then you can continue f4, and this is wonderful. Bishop e3, castles queenside. So against knight g2, f5 doesn't work. What I believe most people play is ed4, actually. And again, this isn't really that good. You play queen d4, knight d4, and for the moment black does keep his pawn, but you are going to have a slightly better position. Bishop to g5, bishop b4, stopping you from taking here. But you can now play the move knight b5, and after knight a6 you castle queenside. And for a mere pawn, this is very rapid development. Not to mention that you are still threatening bishop f6 and knight e4. So this is not easy to get out of. If black is blind and, for example, plays knight g4, then thank you very much. So this is a very nice position. So against e5, the Lemberger counter gambit, the move knight g2 is very nice. Okay, so taking the pawn doesn't really work. f5 doesn't really work. What does work? Knight f6 is the best move. And now we still continue bishop to g5. And after e takes d4, you are basically transposing into the same position. Queen takes d4, knight takes d4, bishop to b4, knight b5. And this forced line, if black plays correctly, is going to give you a slight edge. And you are going to win your pawn back. So the Lemberger counter gambit is really not a problem. And trust me, it's easy to deal with it if you know knight g to e2. Now, let's look at deviations for black after f3. So we are in the position after d4, knight c3. We are not looking at e5 anymore. We are looking at knight f6, which is the main move. And after f3, we said the main thing is take, knight takes, and then black decides what to play. However, there are two sidelines which we have to go over. The first one is e3, Lange-Heinecke defense, and this is not good, because after e3 you simply take, and after e6, which has to be played, you continue bishop d3, and after bishop e7, knight g2, castles kingside. White simply has a slight advantage. You can play queen d2, castles queenside, g4, g5, h4, h5. These two bishops are great. Everything is defended and perfect position. This setup is actually very common in some variations of the exchange Caro-Kann for white, with the difference that this knight should be here and the pawn on c3. So I'm familiar with this piece constellation. It's also common to have this from the Alekhine defense when you play the exchange. So this is a nice attacking setup where h4, h5, g4, g5 come in very handy. The other thing black could try is bishop f5, and this is slightly better than e3, but you simply continue fe, knight e, and queen f3. And this is hard to deal with. You have to defend b7, have to defend the bishop, so knight d6 is forced, and now you continue bishop f4, threatening to take the bishop. After e6, defending the bishop, you castle queenside, and again, a perfect attacking position. And if black plays something like c6, which is very common, then you continue g4 and just start pushing. So the two sidelines are really not advisable. So let's go back to the main line. So knight c3, knight f6, f3, black takes, you take. And now, as we said, there are a couple of options. First, we are going to look at bishop g4, which is the main line. This is called the Teichmann variation, and I don't think it's the best way for black to play, but it's very interesting. So let's have a look at that. After bishop g4, you play the move h3. And now black has two options. He can take or retreat the bishop. Let's look at taking first. That's more popular. You take with the queen, and now the b7 pawn is a relevant factor. So queen takes d4 would simply fail to queen takes b7. So that doesn't work. So against queen takes f3, black has to play c6, and you are now gaining time. There are a couple of ways to play. You can play bishop e3 and castle queenside. That's a viable option. You can play queen f2, defending the pawn. But the best way to play is simply to go forward with g4. And again, now queen takes d4. Since the pawn has now been defended, you might think queen takes d4 works. But again, it should give white a slightly better position. Bishop e3, queen b4, castles queenside. And this initiative is very hard to deal with. Of course, white is 2 pawns down. But after something like e6 and g5 and knight d5, I honestly don't want to be black in this position. I think this is very hard to play. The engine, of course, is going to give you an evaluation which is in favor of black, but try defending f7. I mean, where's your king going? This is hard to play. Okay, so that's bishop takes f3, and if bishop h5 is played, then you simply continue with g4 once again, and after the bishop retreats, you now continue knight e5. And this is where our main attacking ideas come into play. Black should play e6, defending f7 and developing the bishop, and you continue queen f3. Again, queen takes d4, even though it's possible, it's not good. I'm going to show you why. If queen takes d4, then knight g6, a g6, queen b7, and black is going to be losing material. However, in this position, the engine doesn't think black is completely lost. After bishop b4, bishop d2, bishop c3, you have queen e3 check, so that sort of saves you. But after something like this, it should still be pleasant for white, and I don't think white will have such a hard time defending, considering that it's very hard to develop these pieces without any issues. So most people really, I don't think, will take on d4. Most people play c6, defending the pawn. Okay, now you don't care about your d4 pawn, you start attacking. So g5, knight h5, bishop to d3, and queen takes d4 in this position. And again, this is what the opening is about. Don't be scared. Knight takes g6, h takes g6, and rook f1. And we are using the open f file. Our bishops are perfectly placed for an attack. It's not easy to defend this position, and that's the whole point. Black has queen h4, king d1, and now you only have one defense. You can move your f pawn, and that's about it. So you can play either f5 or f6. f5 is more popular, gf, knight f, and now bishop g6 check, king d8. And this position, it's messy. White is just a pawn down. Black's king is, I would say, less secure than white's king. If I had to choose, I would never play this position, but if I was forced to choose a side, I would probably choose white because he has a lead in development. The position usually continues knight e4, queen e4, and it fizzles out into well, a calm position with a lot of trades. If rook h3, then of course rook f8. So this should be about equal. But there are ways to avoid the queen trades. So this is the main line. After bishop g4, you simply continue h3, and if bishop takes f3, then queen f3. And after c6, you just continue g4, g5. If bishop h5, you continue g4 straight away, and then knight e5 and queen f3 and start attacking. So your setup is fairly simple. Move this pawn forward, get this knight to e5, get your queen to f3, get this bishop to either d3 or c4 and start an attack. Okay, now the alternatives. Bishop g4 is the main line. There are three possible variations which are good for black, which he can play instead of going for the main lines. As I said, I prefer bishop f5, and if I'm facing the Blackmar, I'm playing bishop f5. I'll show you the two alternatives first. g6 is called the Bogolubov variation, again after, excuse me, f in Bogolubov. In this position, there is an attacking idea called the Studier attack, or the Studier attack, which starts with bishop c4, and I believe this is a very effective way of fighting g6. So black plays bishop g7 on both sides castle, and the idea behind this fianchetto is to put pressure on the d4 pawn with knight c6 and later on moving your f6 knight. But white has all of his pieces perfectly placed, and he needs to start an attack quickly. If he doesn't, he is simply worse. What you have to watch out for here is knight c6 ideas, c5 ideas, and e5 ideas. So completely breaking your center. Black is sort of playing the Grunfeld attacking idea against this. So white continues queen e1. The idea behind queen e1 is to get the queen to h4, play bishop h6, and double your rooks on the f-file and try to mate. So there are a couple of ways to play bishop g4 or knight c6. They will usually transpose, so I'm going to show you just one line, knight c6, queen h4, defending the pawn, and now bishop to g4. In this position, the defense of the d4 pawn has been interrupted, so you play bishop to e3, and black continues e6, defending f7. And in this position, I think the most active move is knight e5, after which you're hoping for a quick attack. If you don't play knight e5, then the alternative is rook d1, for example. One thing that I want to mention is that if this knight is ever taken, and this is a very important pattern, if bishop f3, then you play rook f3, let's say e6 now, you play rook f1, and for example, well, what can he play? Let's say e5 is played. There's this pattern of playing queen to f2. I think you want to trade first, but okay. But I just want to show you the pattern of playing queen f2. And this is one attacking setup that's going to be very effective, attacking f7. The other attacking setup in this position after e6 and knight e5, this knight, of course, should never be taken because it dislodges the d7 knight and it allows bishop g5. After, for example, bishop f5 is knight c6, bc6, rook a d1 with rooks here, and then playing for bishop h6. And this, again, can be very effective. Imagine a position like this. Let's say white takes the pawn, for example, and you play rook to d2. And let's say, I don't know, rook to b8. Then bishop h6, let's say rook takes, and takes, and takes. And you start playing rook f3 and rook h3. This can be very scary. It doesn't seem scary now, but those are the attacking ideas you have at your disposal. So against the Bogolubov, remember that once black fianchettos on both sides castle, your idea is to play queen e1, queen h4, bishop h6, and start an attack. So this is the way to fight the Bogolubov. The other alternative is e6. This is called the Juve variation, named after the world champion Max Juve. This is not as effective for black. I think you just play bishop g5, and after bishop e7, you play bishop to d3, and you develop normally knight c6, a3, preventing knight b4, h6, bishop f4 or h4 is both fine. And if black castles, you simply continue queen d2. And you want to take here, that's the first thing. You also want to castle queenside or castle kingside, both can be effective. So for example, knight d5 in this position, knight takes d5. If they take with the queen, you can take on c7. If they take with the pawn, I think just castling kingside is good enough. And you're down a pawn, but look at these pieces. This is just marvelous. And I don't think anybody who isn't insane or a masochist would like to have black here. This is just too much attacking pressure. So against the Juve, just remember bishop d3. You continue bishop g5. If they chase your bishop away, you go bishop f4. There are always options of taking on h6. For example, bishop d7 you can already take here. And I mean, they can defend for a while. It's not that it's made straight away, but it's just I wouldn't want to play this with black. Okay, and now for my favorite variation. Bishop f5. This is called the Gunderam Defense. And in my opinion, there's no easy way to play against this. This is a very scary move, which doesn't allow h3, so you don't get to gain a tempo. It prepares e6 with the bishop outside of the pawn chain. It attacks c2, and it prevents... It doesn't prevent, but it plays against bishop d3, which is your most effective move. Now, we're going to have a look at three moves: knight e5, bishop d3, and bishop c4. Knight e5 is the most popular. Bishop d3 is best according to the engine. But I think for most Blackmar Gambit players, it's very hard to play the move bishop d3, so let's look at that first. After this, black simply trades and then plays e6. And there's no way you will have enough attacking pressure. There's just no way. I mean, this is a very nice position. Sorry, not e6, c6 first. You want to prevent queen to b5 check, winning your b7 pawn. But on the next move, e6 comes, and black is basically playing a Caro-Kann setup with an extra pawn. So I don't know, let's say you castle, e6, I don't know, bishop g5, bishop e7, Caro-Kann, a pawn up. If you put the pawn on f2, then this is a normal Caro-Kann. Actually, if you put this knight on d2, pawn on c3, then it's an even more normal Caro-Kann. I mean, there's just nothing here for white. No attacking ideas, in my opinion. So bishop d3, even though the engine says is the best move, I don't think you should play that. Okay, the two other options are knight e5 and bishop c4. Knight e5, which is the most popular, I honestly don't like at all. So there are two ways to play. You can play e6 or c6. If you play c6, then bishop c4 sort of transposes to the c4 lines. And the idea is that with the knight on e5, you get to play a quick g4. I don't think this is as effective because there's a nice trick in this position. Black, of course, doesn't have to retreat and allow this. This doesn't have to be allowed. There's a nice trick here which you should learn if you play this with black, and I do play this with black, so I know the trick, and it's knight f to d7. And in this position, if the bishop is taken, then of course queen h4. And after king f1, knight takes e5 and the pawn is pinned, and this is an overwhelming advantage for black, in my opinion. For example, bishop e2, saving the bishop, queen h3 check, king e1. Now you can safely move the knight. Who would want this position with white? So yeah, so after knight e5, c6 doesn't work. Let's look at e6. If you play g4 now, of course, there's no knight fd7 because there's no bishop on c4, so you have to retreat your bishop. And in this position, the way for white to continue and start justifying his play is queen f3, putting pressure on b7. But after c6, he doesn't have enough. g5, for example, bishop h5, again, seems tricky, but it really isn't tricky. Bishop e2, knight takes e5, bishop takes h5, knight g6 for example. Black is basically defending, and as soon as bishop d6 comes, I think the counterplay is over, and that's why I don't like the move knight e5. And I've actually never faced knight e5, but I wish I did. And so again, let me take you through my favorite variation. I'm going to get to it again. So d5, the Blackmar Gambit, d4, knight c3, knight f6, f3, takes, and bishop f5. So bishop d3, no attacking ideas. Knight e5, very risky and fizzles out into a position where white doesn't have any sort of attack. Now bishop c4 is kind of interesting, and I believe this gives white the most chances. Of course, e6 is the only move. You don't want to allow any tricks on f7. And now the way to continue this position, there are two ways to continue, but the main idea is playing d5. And you can play d5 straight away, but it's not as effective. What I would recommend is castling. And now if black isn't careful, let me turn on the engine to tell you what the best move is. The best move is knight c6. According to the engine, the second best is c6. Now the best is c6. Yeah. Okay, so the engine gives this as minus 1.4. However, if you don't play c6, if you play something normal like bishop e7, then d5 is actually extremely annoying. Your king is still in the center, and you can easily lose this position. Let me show you how. So for example, ed5, knight d5, knight d5, bishop d5. And in this position, b7 is hanging. There are also tricks on f7. There are also tricks with knight e5 or knight g5. The basic threat is bishop f7. So let me show you what happens. If you play c6, simply defending your pawn, then you actually lose. Bishop takes f7, king takes f7, and you don't play knight e5, you play knight d4. This bishop is pinned, and that's it. If g6, then rook takes f5, g takes f5, queen h5 check, king to g8 for example, knight takes f5, and this is monstrous. This is just over. If for example bishop c5, king h1, I don't know, probably queen f6 is the best move to try and defend, but black is so undeveloped and this rook is so never getting out that white's position is actually winning. This is +9, +10 now. Yeah. Okay, so remember that after bishop c4 and e6, after white castles, you don't allow d5. You play the move c6 straight away. And this is very important. After c6, again, black is fine. You may lose your bishop pair. He might take on f5. But you're going to play bishop e7 and castles kingside and have a solid position. Okay, so that was my overview of the Blackmar. Let me give you a short summary. So against this, if you don't take, you either go into the Caro-Kann or the French. If you do take, white is going to play knight c3. You can choose to play e5, which is, well, sort of strong. But I wouldn't recommend it. And again, if queen h5 is played, you know what to do. So I should play knight g2 e2. If you don't play e5, then knight f6 is the main move. White is going to play f3. Don't play bishop f5 or e3, just take. And after knight takes, I would recommend the move bishop f5. And you should be fine with this move. I actually like it a lot. White should play bishop to c4. That's one option. And then castle and play for d5. So e6 and castles. What you have to be careful about is allowing d5. So just play c6. Okay, I hope you liked the video. Hope you got something. My main hope is that d5 players are going to now be equipped to play against this, I'm going to call it, annoying gambit. And I hope you never lose against it. Let me know what you think. Stay tuned for more chess. Bye bye.